The first sound was the splintering of the doorframe, a sharp, violent crack that cut through the sleepy afternoon hum of the Redemption First National Bank. It was the sound of a world breaking. From her seat on the polished oak bench, Evelyn felt the vibration travel through the floorboards, a tremor that ran up her spine like a jolt of fear. She was 19, and her world was measured not in sights, but in sensations just like this one. The air, moments before tasting of lemon polish and dry paper, was suddenly thick with the metallic tang of gunpowder and the raw, earthy scent of unwashed bodies. Heavy footsteps, too many to count, thundered across the floor, their cadence chaotic and menacing. A woman gasped. A man swore under his breath. Evelyn's hand shot out, finding the rough tweed of her father's sleeve. "Papa," she whispered, her voice a thin thread in the sudden tapestry of terror. "Stay down." Evie Samuel Ellsworth's voice was low and steady, a rock in the churning sea of panic. He pulled her down with him, his arm a shield around her shoulders, as they crouched behind the bench. The sharp scent of his bay rum tonic was a small familiar comfort in the overwhelming chaos. A voice chillingly calm and carrying over the panicked shuffles sliced through the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a simple transaction. Your cooperation will be rewarded with your continued good health." It wasn't the words, but the delivery that froze the blood. The voice was smooth, educated, entirely out of place amidst the grunts and curses of the other men. Evelyn tilted her head, her primary sense organ, trying to place the man by sound alone. He was tall. His voice came from above the heads of the cowering patrons. He moved with a confident, almost lazy stride, the jingle of his spurs soft and rhythmic. "The cash drawers first," the calm voice commanded, "then the vault." The bank teller, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose wheezing breath Evelyn could identify from 20 paces, stammered, "The vault. It's on a time lock." A hard crack like a whip echoed through the room, followed by Abernathy's pained cry. "I find that necessity is a wonderful key," the leader said, his tone unchanged. Evelyn flinched, pressing her face into her father's coat. She could hear the frantic scraping of metal as Abernathy worked the combination, his terrified sobs punctuating the clicks of the tumblers. The heavy groan of the vault door swinging open seemed to suck the very air from the room. But the robbers weren't just stuffing canvas bags with cash. The leader's footsteps moved past the main vault and toward the wall of safe deposit boxes. "Box 112, he commanded. Abernathy whimpered. "That requires a second key?" "The owner's key." "Then we shall make do." The sickening thud of a sledgehammer against steel rang out once, twice, a third time, followed by the shriek of tortured metal. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. Box 112. Her father's box. Their box. "What do they want?" Samuel murmured, his own fear a low hum against her ear. The leader emerged from the vault. His footsteps stopped unnervingly close to their hiding place. Evelyn held her breath. A scent drifted down to her expensive cigar smoke and the rich, oiled smell of worn leather. It was a scent of power, of authority. He wasn't interested in them. He was speaking to one of his men. "Is this it?" "Yes, sir, just like you described." A small, velvet-lined box was opened with a soft click. Evelyn heard the faint metallic slide of an object being removed. The leader grunted in satisfaction. He turned to leave, his boots scuffing the floor directly in front of her. As he passed, something small and hard fell bouncing once on the oak floorboards before rolling to a stop near Evelyn's outstretched hand. Instinctively, her fingers closed around it. It was cool, metallic, and heavy. A locket. She didn't need to see the intricate engraving her fingers traced to know what it was. A delicate weeping willow tree, its branches lovingly detailed, curling around a single small sapphire. Her mother's locket. The only thing she had left of her. A strangled cry escaped her lips. The footsteps stopped. The world went silent. The scent of cigar smoke and leather intensified as the man crouched down. Evelyn could feel the heat radiating from his body. "What have we here?" The calm voice was now a venomous whisper. Samuel moved, placing himself more fully in front of her. "She's just a girl. She's blind. Please just take what you want and go." A rough hand shot out and snatched the locket from Evelyn's grasp. His fingers brushed against hers. They were long, slender, and disturbingly cold. He stood the leather of his holster creaking. "A sentimental fool just like her mother," he mused, his voice distant again. Then with a sharp command, "We're done here." The thunder of boots returned, moving toward the shattered door. The chaos receded as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a wake of splintered wood, sobbing patrons, and the suffocating smell of fear. Evelyn didn't move. She remained crouched on the floor, her world reduced to the lingering scent of cigar smoke and the ghost of a willow tree etched not on silver, but on the inside of her soul. Her father was alive, his arm was still around her, but something vital had been torn away. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the last tangible piece of a memory, the final anchor to a woman she knew only through her father's stories, and the feel of a cool silver locket in her hand. And in that hollow, echoing silence, a cold, hard certainty began to form. She would get it back. 2 weeks later, life in Redemption had settled back into its familiar dusty rhythm. But for Evelyn, the world remained tilted on its axis. The trading post, a sprawling adobe structure half a mile south of town, felt more like a fortress than a home. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, whistling through the skeletal mesquite branches outside, was a potential threat. She moved through the familiar space with a grace that belied her lack of sight. Her father had taught her to map the world in sound and scent, and the post was her masterpiece. She could distinguish the dusty sweetness of dried apples from the earthy aroma of pinto beans, the sharp tang of lye soap from the rich, dark scent of coffee. She knew the unique cadence of each regular customer's walk and the weary sigh of a farmer versus the impatient shuffle of a ranch hand. Her blindness was not a void. It was a canvas painted with a different palette of senses. "The order from St. Louis is late," she said, running her fingers over the smooth, worn wood of the counter. The air told her the shelves where the bolts of cotton should be were too empty, holding only dust and stale air. Samuel grunted from behind the counter where he was mending a leather harness. "Wagon probably threw a wheel near Santa Rosa. It'll get here." He was trying to sound normal, but Evelyn could hear the strain in his voice, a tightness that hadn't been there before the robbery. He was more watchful, his movements quicker to startle. The bell over the door chimed a polite, deferential sound. Evelyn immediately stiffened. The footsteps were slow measured, the sound absorbed by expensive, well-soled boots. And with them came a familiar scent, faint but unmistakable, under a cloying layer of cologne, cigar smoke, and leather. "Samuel, my friend," a smooth, cultured voice said. It was the voice of Silas Kane. Evelyn turned her face toward the sound, her expression a blank mask. Kane was the unofficial king of Redemption. He owned the saloon, the hotel, and half the ranches in the valley. He presented himself as the town's benevolent protector, a man of progress and vision. But Evelyn could hear the lie beneath the polished veneer. His words were too smooth, his pauses too calculated. "A man who lies has a shadow that walks crooked," a visiting Apache trader had once told her father. Silas Kane's shadow, she imagined, must be a twisted thing. "Silas Samuel," said, his voice polite but cool. "What can we do for you?" "I was just in town overseeing the repairs on the bank. A terrible business, that robbery. I was relieved to hear you and your lovely daughter were unharmed." His gaze, she felt, flickered over to her. It was like the touch of a spider. "Evelyn, you are looking well." "I'm fine, Mr. Kane," she said, her tone as crisp as autumn leaves. Kane chuckled, a sound like dry sticks rubbing together. Always so direct, a fine quality in a woman. He turned his attention back to Samuel. "In fact, it's you I came to see, Samuel. This robbery, it's a sign. The territory is growing wilder. This post is isolated, vulnerable. It's a heavy burden for a man getting on in his years." "It's a burden I'm happy to carry," Samuel replied, the sound of his hammer striking leather, a sharp punctuation to his words. Of course. Kane said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "But think of Evelyn. A young woman in her position needs security, stability. The town is where she belongs." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "I'll be frank. I'm expanding my holdings. I want to build a new cattle depot where this post stands. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. Enough to set you both up with a nice house in town, away from all this." He gestured vaguely at the desert beyond the door. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Evelyn could feel her father's anger, a low simmering heat. "The answer is the same as it was last year, Silas, and the year before," that Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My wife is buried on that hill out back. I built this place with my own 2 hands. It's not for sale." Kane was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, the manufactured warmth was gone, replaced by a thin layer of ice. "Loyalty is an admirable trait, Samuel. But misplaced, it can become a weakness. A man should know when to let go of the past before it drags him down." He cleared his throat, the polished mask sliding back into place. "Think on it. The offer stands." The bell chimed again as he left, leaving behind the ghost of his scent and a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Evelyn stood perfectly still, listening to his footsteps fade. "He's a snake, Papa," she whispered. "I know," Samuel said, his voice weary. "But even a snake can only strike if you get too close." He set down his tools and came around the counter, his hand finding her shoulder. "Don't you worry about Silas Kane. He can't force us to do anything." But as Evelyn leaned into her father's embrace, the memory of the robber's cold fingers and the bitter, possessive way he'd spoken of her mother echoed in her mind. Kane's words about letting go of the past felt less like advice and more like a threat. A threat aimed at the very heart of their family, a heart that had already been grievously wounded. The end came a week later. It arrived not with the thunder of a robbery, but with the stealth of a whisper in the dead of night. Evelyn was woken by the sound of splintering wood. Not the door this time, but the back window of the storeroom. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Papa," she called out, her voice swallowed by the sudden oppressive silence. No answer. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She fumbled for the cane by her bed, her knuckles white. The floorboards were cold beneath her bare feet as she crept from her room. The main trading post was dark, the air thick with a new terrifying scent that overpowered the familiar smells of her home, the coppery tang of fresh blood. A floorboard groaned in the storeroom. 2 sets of footsteps, not her father's. They were heavy, clumsy moving, with a grim purpose. She flattened herself against the wall, her breath held tight in her chest. They weren't stealing things. They were searching. Drawers were wrenched open, their contents dumped unceremoniously onto the floor. "It ain't here," a rough voice grumbled. "Kane said the old man kept his deed and papers in a lockbox back here," another voice replied. "Well, Kane was wrong. Let's get out of here before someone comes." The footsteps moved toward the back of the post, fading into the night. Evelyn waited, her body trembling, until the only sound was the frantic drumming of her own heart. She forced her legs to move her cane, tapping a frantic, unsteady rhythm on the wooden floor. "Papa," she called again, a desperate plea. She followed the scent of blood, a sickeningly warm trail that led her behind the main counter. And then her cane hit something soft, something horribly still. She dropped to her knees, her hands shaking as they explored the shape on the floor. A worn cotton shirt, a familiar sturdy frame. Her fingers brushed against his face, his beard rough against her skin, and then found the terrible sticky wetness matting the hair at the back of his head. He was gone. The silence that answered her unspoken question was absolute, a vast, soul-crushing emptiness. The solid, comforting presence that had been the center of her universe had been extinguished. A strangled sob tore from her throat, a sound of pure, animal grief. She collapsed onto him, her hands clutching his shirt, her cheek pressed against a chest that would never again rise and fall with breath. The world dissolved into a blackness deeper than any her eyes had ever known. Dawn broke, painting the crimson sand outside in hues of blood and fire. When Sheriff Briggs arrived, summoned by a passing freight driver, he found Evelyn still sitting on the floor, cradling her father's head in her lap. Her dress was stained, her face pale and tear-streaked, but her unseeing eyes were fixed on the far wall with a terrifying intensity. Briggs, a man whose spine had been replaced by greed long ago, made a show of inspecting the scene. He was Kane's man, bought and paid for, and he played his part with practiced ease. "A raid," he announced, his voice filled with false gravity. "Looks like Apache work. They've been getting bolder." He nudged a deliberately overturned barrel with his boot. Stole supplies probably spooked Samuel when he confronted them. He walked over to the shattered back window and picked something up from the sill. "Well, what do you know?" He held up a single black-tipped arrowhead. "Here's our culprit." He pocketed it. "There's a warrior who's been seen in these parts. Kale, they call him. A troublemaker. This has his mark all over it." Evelyn didn't look at him. Her world had narrowed to a single burning point of focus. She had heard the men's voices. They were white men. They had spoken of Kane. It wasn't Apache, she said, her voice a dead, hollow thing. Briggs sighed, a sound of weary condescension. "Miss Ellsworth, you're in shock. You couldn't have seen." "I heard them," she snapped her head, whipping toward the sound of his voice. For the first time, a fire ignited in the depths of her grief. They were looking for a lockbox, for a deed. One of them called out his name. Kane. The sheriff's face hardened. Grief plays tricks on the mind. "You heard what you wanted to hear." He gestured to two of his deputies. "Take care of the body. Miss Ellsworth, you'll come with me. We'll find a place for you in town until the council decides what to do with the property." The property. The word hung in the blood-soaked air, a vulture circling its prey. It was never about justice. It was always about the land, about the deed. Evelyn slowly, stiffly got to her feet. She was alone now, utterly alone. But as the deputies carried her father's body away, a vow took root in the shattered pieces of her heart. A vow colder and harder than desert iron. Kane had taken her mother's locket. He had taken her father's life. He thought he had taken everything. He was wrong. He had left her with a purpose, and she would see it through even if it meant walking through hell to do it. In the days that followed, Evelyn moved through a fog of detached purpose. The town of redemption, under the suffocating influence of Silas Kane, wrapped her in a blanket of cloying pity that felt more like a shroud. She was housed in a small room at the back of the preacher's house, a space that smelled of mothballs and stale piety. The townsfolk brought her food she didn't eat and offered condolences that felt like stones in her mouth. They saw a poor blind orphan. They didn't see the silent, calculating mind at work behind her still gray eyes. She refused to speak of the murder again, knowing her words would be dismissed as the ravings of a grief-stricken girl. Sheriff Briggs had closed the case, his official report blaming the renegade Apache, known as Kale. It was a neat, simple lie that everyone was eager to believe. It was easier than confronting the darkness in their own midst. But Evelyn remembered. She replayed the sounds of that night over and over in her mind, the specific weight of the intruders' boots, the gravelly timbre of their voices, the way one of them had a slight, wheezing catch in his breath. And she remembered something else. In the moments after they had fled, as she'd knelt in the dark beside her father, her questing hand had brushed against something small and metallic on the floorboards, snagged on a splintered plank. It was a button ornate and heavy made of silver. She had clutched it in her fist, a single hard piece of evidence in a world of lies. It now lay wrapped in a handkerchief, hidden in the pocket of her dress, its secret weight a constant reminder of her vow. Her investigation began not with questions, but with listening. She sat on the porch of the preacher's house, seemingly lost in her sorrow, and cataloged the sounds of the town. She learned to identify every man by the sound of his spit hitting the dust, every woman by the swish of her skirts. She listened for a man with a wheezing breath and heavy, clumsy footsteps. Her search for the button's origin was more difficult. She couldn't simply show it to the town's blacksmith or tailor. That would be a declaration of war she wasn't ready to fight. She had to be smarter. She started by visiting the seamstress, Mrs. Gable, under the pretense of needing a dress mended. As the older woman worked her needle, clicking a steady rhythm, Evelyn described the button with meticulous detail. "It was on a coat my father once owned," she lied smoothly. "Silver with a design like a coiled snake eating its own tail." Mrs. Gable paused, her needle hovering. "An Ouroboros. Peculiar design for these parts. Sounds more like something a fancy tailor back east would make. The only one I know who does custom silver work like that is a fellow named Elias Reed. Disgraced, they say. Drank his talent away. Lives in a shack out in the old mining camp, takes odd jobs." The first thread. Evelyn thanked her and left. The old mining camp was miles from town, deep in the Badlands. It was not a place for a blind girl to go alone. She needed a guide, a protector. She needed the very man the town had condemned. She needed to find Kale. Finding an Apache warrior who didn't want to be found was a fool's errand for most. But Evelyn had an advantage. She didn't look with her eyes, she listened with her soul. The Apache her father had told her moved with the land, not against it. They left whispers, not footprints. She started at her father's trading post, now boarded up and silent, a ghost of a place. She walked the land behind it, out to the small, windswept hill where her parents were buried. She stood between the two simple wooden crosses, the wind whipping strands of her red hair across her face. It was here her father had taught her to listen to the language of the desert, the chitter of a lizard, the rustle of a snake in the sagebrush, the unnatural silence that preceded the arrival of a predator. She spent 2 days listening, waiting. On the third morning, she heard it. The faint, almost imperceptible sound of a horse stepping on stone instead of sand. It was a deliberate, controlled movement, not a lost animal, not a clumsy rider. She didn't call out. She simply sat on the ground, faced the direction of the sound, and waited. Minutes stretched into an hour. The sun beat down hot and unforgiving. Finally, a voice spoke from behind her, so close it made her jump. "The town hunts for me. Why do you seek me?" The voice was low and resonant, like stones shifting deep underground. She turned slowly. Because you are the only one who might believe me. Cale stepped into her awareness. He didn't smell of whiskey or tobacco like the town men. He smelled of pine smoke, clean earth, and something wild like the desert after a rain. He moved with a silent grace, his presence a quiet weight in the air. They say you murdered Samuel Ellsworth, she stated, her voice even. They lie, he said. There was no defensiveness in his tone, just a flat statement of fact. I know. She reached into her pocket and unwrapped the handkerchief, holding the silver button out on her palm. My father's killers dropped this. She felt him move closer, felt the air stir as he leaned in to examine it. He didn't touch it. White man's silver, he said. Heavy, made for a rich man. His name is Silas Kane Evelyn, said the name like poison on her tongue. He runs redemption. He murdered my father for his land and framed you for it. A long silence followed. She could hear the soft whistle of his breath, the subtle shift of his weight from one foot to the other. He was considering her, judging her story, her intent. Why come to me, he asked finally. Your sheriff has a posse. The sheriff is Kane's dog. The town is blind with fear. They see an Apache and they see a savage. They look at me and see a helpless girl. Her voice hardened. We are the two people in this valley no one will listen to. That means we have to listen to each other. Another silence. Then she heard a soft thud as he knelt in front of her. His hand, calloused and warm, gently took the button from her palm. These men, he said, his voice a low growl. They rode through our hunting grounds the night your father died. They ambushed my cousin who was tracking game. They killed him. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was his too. Their paths of grief and vengeance had converged here on this lonely hill under the unforgiving sun. A tailor named Elias Reed made this button, she said. He lives in the old mining camp. Will you take me there? Kyle stood the button enclosed in his fist. The men I hunt wore clothes of rich fabric. They smelled of cigar smoke. They rode shod horses. He paused. They are the same men. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't offer words of comfort or alliance. He simply turned and walked toward the rocks where his horse was hidden. A moment later, he returned leading a striking pinto mare. Get on, he said. It wasn't a request. Evelyn rose her cane-finding purchase in the dry soil. This was it. The first step off the edge of the world she knew. It was a terrifying, reckless leap of faith, guided only by a silver button and the voice of a man with his own ghosts to hunt. She allowed him to lift her onto the horse settling behind him. His back was a solid wall of muscle and resolve. As they rode away from the graves, away from the boarded-up post and the town of lies, Evelyn didn't feel like a helpless girl. For the first time since her father's death, she felt the flicker of something that had been extinguished hope, as sharp and dangerous as a shard of glass. The journey into the Badlands was a baptism by fire and stone. The landscape shifted from the familiar dusty plains around Redemption to a jagged alien world of crimson rock and deep, shadowed canyons. The wind whispered secrets through skeletal mesquite branches, and the sun was a merciless eye in a bleached white sky. For Evelyn, it was a symphony of new sensations, the grit of sand on her teeth, the sharp scent of pinyon and juniper, the way the air grew cold and still as they descended into a ravine. Kyle was a man of few words, but his actions spoke a language Evelyn understood perfectly. He navigated the treacherous terrain with an innate certainty, his horse's hooves finding paths that didn't seem to exist. He communicated in the Apache way, with observation. He taught her to feel the subtle shift in the air current that signaled an approaching canyon, to identify the direction of water, by the scent of damp stone, to hear the unnatural silence of the birds that warned of a predator nearby. They formed an uneasy rhythm. During the day, they rode in near silence, a pact of shared purpose suspended between them. At night, they made cold camps in the shelter of rock overhangs, sharing dried meat and water from a shared canteen. In the flickering light of a small smokeless fire, the wall of silence between them began to crack. "Why do they call you Kale?" she asked one night, tracing the rim of her tin cup. "It doesn't sound like an Apache name." He stared into the flames, his profile etched in light and shadow. "It is not. My name is Yiska. It means the night is over." The white soldiers at the reservation could not say it. They called me Kale. A name given by an enemy is a cage. I left it behind. "But you still use it." "It reminds me," he said, his voice low, "of what was taken." She understood, just as the stolen locket was a constant reminder for her. They were both defined in their own ways by what they had lost. Their alliance was not one of friendship, not yet. It was an alliance of ghosts. On the third day, the threat they were running from caught up to them. They were navigating a narrow pass, the rock walls rising steeply on either side, when Evelyn's head snapped up. "Wait," she whispered, her hand tightening on Kyle's arm. He reined in the Pinto instantly. "What is it?" "Listen." The canyon was silent. Too silent. The ever-present buzz of insects had ceased. The birds were gone. It was the unnatural silence she'd been taught to recognize. "Ambush," she breathed. Before Kale could react, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the pass. Gunfire erupted. A bullet whined past Evelyn's ear, close enough for her to feel its heat. Glass shattered. No, not glass. Rock. Splinters of rock exploded from the canyon wall beside them. Kale moved. He urged the horse forward, not back, charging through the kill zone with a guttural cry. He slid from the saddle, pulling Evelyn down with him into the relative cover of a cluster of boulders. The Pinto, trained for battle, galloped on drawing fire before veering off into a side canyon. Evelyn hit the floor, a hard, dusty floor of rock and grit. Kyle was beside her, a long knife already in his hand. "How many?" he hissed. Evelyn closed her eyes, filtering out the deafening roar of the gunshots, focusing on the subtler sounds. "3," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline singing in her veins. 2 on the ridge to the left, 1 higher up on the right. She could hear the distinct sound of their boots scraping on rock, the click of a rifle being reloaded. Kale nodded, his eyes scanning the ridges. He was a force of nature unleashed. He moved with a speed and silence that was breathtaking, a blur of motion against the red rock. He was a ghost, a hunter in his own element. Evelyn could only follow his progress through sound, a dislodged pebble, a muffled grunt, a sickening thud, and then silence from one of the positions. A man shouted from the opposite ridge, his voice tight with panic. "Jed, you see him?" Silence. The man on the right began firing wildly, the bullets ricocheting off the rocks around her. Evelyn pressed herself flatter against the ground, the smell of gunpowder and hot stone filling her nostrils. Then she heard it, a new sound. The wheezing breath of a man struggling for air. It was him, one of the men from her father's storeroom. He was closer now, scrambling down the rocks toward their position. "Come on out, Apache," he yelled, his voice raw. "We just want the girl." Kale was silent. A deadly predator waiting. The man's clumsy footsteps grew louder. Evelyn could hear his ragged breathing, smell the stale sweat of his fear. He was just around the other side of their boulder. She acted on pure instinct. She grabbed a fist-sized rock from the ground and with all her strength hurled it against the canyon wall 10 feet to her left. The sound was sharp, loud. The wheezing man swore and fired 2 shots in that direction. In that split second of distraction, Kyle moved. There was a blur of motion, a choked cry, and then a heavy, final thump. The third man, seeing he was now alone, let out a string of curses and began to retreat his boots, slipping and sliding on the loose scree. Kyle let him go. Silence descended once more, broken only by the whistling wind. Kyle returned to her side. His breathing controlled, his movements precise. There was a fresh splatter of blood on his buckskin shirt. "You heard him," Kyle stated, his voice flat. Evelyn nodded, her body still trembling. He was one of them. She took a shuddering breath. "Thank you." "You warned me," he replied, a simple acknowledgement of the debt. "Your ears are sharper than my eyes." That night, their campfire was smaller, more guarded. The respect between them had been forged anew, tempered in the heat of battle. Kyle cleaned his knife, the firelight glinting on the steel. Evelyn sorted through the small satchel of her father's belongings she'd brought with her. Her fingers brushed against a stiff piece of cardboard. It was a photograph. She pulled it out, though she couldn't see it. "What is this?" she asked, holding it out to him. He took it. A picture. A man and a woman. "My parents." "The woman, yes. She has your hair. But the man—" Kyle paused. His face is torn away. All you can see is his hand on her shoulder. He wears a ring. "A ring? What does it look like?" "Silver," Kale said. "Like your button. A snake eating its own tail." Evelyn's blood ran cold. An Ouroboros. The same design. And then she remembered. The polite chime of the bell at the trading post. The smooth, cultured voice. Silas Kane extending a hand to shake her father's. A flash of light on his finger. He always wore a large, ornate silver ring. "Kale," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's him. It was always him." The ambush wasn't just to silence them. It was to get her. Kane didn't just want her gone. He wanted her. The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. This vendetta, this dark obsession, was more twisted and personal than she could have ever imagined. The old mining camp was a ghost town of skeletal structures and gaping mine shafts, a monument to broken dreams. Elias Reed, the tailor, lived in a shack on the edge of the settlement, a hovel that seemed held together by rust and sheer despair. The air inside smelled of cheap whiskey, unwashed linen, and regret. Reed was a scarecrow of a man with trembling hands and eyes that darted nervously around the room. He flinched when Kale stepped through the door, a silent shadow filling the space. "We're not here to hurt you," Evelyn said, her voice calm and steady. She stood in the doorway, her presence a stark contrast to the squalor of the room. "We need to ask you about something you made." Kale placed the silver button on the rickety table. Reed stared at it as if it were a venomous spider. "I don't know nothing about that," he stammered, backing away. "Don't lie." Kyle's voice was a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "A man who lies has a shadow that walks crooked. Yours is already halfway to the devil." The tailor swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. "He'll kill me." "We will," Kale said, his meaning perfectly, chillingly clear. Evelyn stepped forward, her cane tapping softly on the dirt floor. "My father is already dead," she said, her voice softening slightly. "The man who wore this button killed him. All we want is his name." Reed's resolve crumbled. He sank onto a stool, his head in his hands. "Kane," he whispered. "Silas Kane. I made a suit for him years ago when he first came to Redemption. He was a different man then. Broken. Looked like he'd crawled out of his own grave." Lost everything he had back east, he said. Paid me with the last of his money for a gentleman's suit. Said a man's appearance is the first lie he tells the world. He looked up, his eyes pleading. He has a temper, a cold fire in him. He's not a man you cross. As Reed spoke, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in Evelyn's mind. The torn photograph, the silver ring, the locket engraved with a willow tree, a symbol of grief and remembrance. And Cain's words at the post. A man should know when to let go of the past before it drags him down. He wasn't talking to her father. He was talking about himself. It wasn't about the land, she said more to herself than to Cale. It was never about the land. What was it about Cale? Asked, his gaze fixed on her. My mother. The words felt strange and heavy. The mother she had never known was at the center of this web of deceit and murder. Before she married my father, she lived back east. Cain must have known her there. He didn't want the trading post. He wanted to destroy my father. He wanted to erase him, to erase everything that belonged to her that wasn't him. The bank robbery wasn't for money. It was for the locket. It was an act of jealous rage, a symbolic theft of her mother's memory. The revelation was staggering, recontextualizing everything. They weren't just fighting a greedy land baron. They were fighting a man consumed by a decades-old obsession, a man whose patient, meticulous revenge had finally reached its bloody conclusion. Their new knowledge was a dangerous weapon, but before they could decide how to wield it, Cain struck again. They left the tailor's shack to find the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the dead town. As they prepared to move on, the sound of hoofbeats reached them, not a few riders, but a dozen or more. A posse. They were silhouetted against the blood-red horizon, led by Sheriff Briggs. But he wasn't coming for the tailor. He was coming for them. There they are. Briggs's voice boomed across the desolate landscape. The Apache murderer and his hostage. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Hostage. Cain was twisting the narrative, painting her as a victim, a helpless blind girl stolen away by a savage. He was turning her into a weapon against Cale. From a different direction, another rider appeared. A lone prospector, his face a mask of manufactured terror, pointed a shaking finger at Cale. That's him. That's the Apache who killed my partner. Saw him with my own eyes. It was a lie, perfectly timed, brutally effective. Cain hadn't just anticipated their move. He had orchestrated a checkmate. He had framed Cale for another murder, turning the full righteous fury of the law against them. There was no going back to redemption, no pleading their case. In the eyes of the world, he was a killer, and she was his pawn. We have to run, Cale said, his voice grim. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward the labyrinth of abandoned mines behind the town. Gunshots erupted, kicking up dust around their feet. They were no longer investigators seeking justice. They were fugitives, hunted and alone, with the entire weight of Cain's lies bearing down on them. They plunged into the darkness of the nearest mine shaft, the shouts of the posse echoing behind them, the world shrinking to a desperate flight for survival. There was nowhere left to turn, nowhere to hide. The only way out now was straight through the heart of the storm. For 2 days, they were ghosts in the wilderness, hunted animals with the baying of hounds at their heels. They moved through the labyrinthine badlands, using the ancient forgotten trails Cale knew, doubling back on their tracks, sleeping in short, fitful bursts in caves that smelled of bat guano and damp earth. The posse was relentless, guided by Cain's money and the town's righteous fury. Evelyn could hear them in the distance, the shouts of men and the baying of dogs carried on the wind, a constant menacing reminder that they were trapped. On the 3rd day, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The air grew heavy and still charged with a strange electric tension. The birds fell silent. "A storm is coming," Kyle said, his voice a low rumble. He tilted his face to the sky, sniffing the air. A big one. A sandstorm. Evelyn felt a tremor of fear, but also a spark of an idea, desperate and wild. "A storm provides cover," she said. "It blinds men who rely on their eyes." Cale looked at her, understanding dawning in his own dark eyes. "You want to go back. It's the one place they won't look for us." She argued, her voice gaining strength. "In the heart of the beast. Cain has made us monsters, so let's give them a monster they can't ignore. We can't prove our innocence out here, Cale. The proof and the witnesses are all in redemption." It was a gamble that bordered on suicide, but it was the only move they had left. As the first gusts of wind began to howl through the canyons, whipping sand into stinging clouds, they turned the Pinto mare back toward the town of Redemption. They arrived at the edge of town as the storm hit in full force. It was a biblical fury, a roaring wall of sand that scoured the landscape and reduced visibility to near zero. The world was a maelstrom of screaming wind and stinging grit. Buildings were vague groaning shapes in the gloom. The streets were deserted. They left the horse in the shelter of the abandoned livery stable and made their way on foot, leaning into the wind, the howling gale, a cloak for their movements. Their destination was the Grand Saloon, Cain's opulent monument to his own power. Evelyn knew he would be there. In a storm, men of power gather in places of comfort to wait it out. It was where he held court, where he met with his cronies. It was where the heart of the beast lay. They slipped in through the back kitchen door, the noise of their entry swallowed by the storm's roar. The saloon was dim, lit by swaying oil lamps that cast long dancing shadows. The windows rattled in their frames, and the wind moaned through the eaves like a dying animal. A handful of men were inside, trapped by the storm. Sheriff Briggs, said the lying prospector, 2 of Cain's brutish ranch foremen, and Silas Cain himself. He was seated at his usual table in the back, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking perfectly calm, the eye of his own personal hurricane. The moment Kyle stepped from the kitchen into the main room, a knife in his hand, and the saloon fell silent, then the only sounds the fury of the storm outside and the sharp intake of breaths. "Evening, Sheriff," Kyle said, his voice as calm as the grave. Briggs fumbled for his pistol, his face paling. "Kyle, you're under arrest." Evelyn stepped out from behind Kyle, her cane tapping once on the floorboards. The sound cut through the tension like a gunshot. All eyes turned to her. Cain's expression was the first to shift from shock to a cold reptilian smile. "Evelyn, my dear, you're safe. We were so worried. This savage forced you to come here, did he?" "He didn't force me to do anything, Silas," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made the men flinch. She took a step forward, her unseeing eyes fixed on the space where she knew Cain sat. "I'm here to ask you a question. In front of your men. In front of the sheriff. What did my mother do to you? Or do to—" The smile on Cain's face froze. The air in the room crackled. Briggs and the others looked from Evelyn to Cain, confusion and fear on their faces. "I don't know what you're talking about," Cain said, his voice losing some of its smoothness. "Don't you?" Evelyn's own smile was thin and dangerous. "You knew her back east. You gave her a silver locket engraved with a willow tree. You wore a ring that matched the design, a snake eating its own tail." Cain's knuckles were white where he gripped his whiskey glass. "These are the delusions of a hysterical child." "Are they?" she pressed, taking another step. "Then tell me this is a delusion. Her name was Eleanor, and before she met my father, she was engaged to you. But she found out what you were. A criminal. A man who built his first fortune on smuggling and extortion. So she left you. But she did more than that. She wrote a letter, an anonymous testimony to the authorities. It cost you everything. Your fortune, your family name, your future. She ruined you. The saloon was utterly silent now. The storm outside, the only thing that moved. Kane slowly rose to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. The polite mask was gone. In its place was a face contorted by a rage that had festered for 20 years. She was mine, he hissed, his voice a venomous rasp. She belonged to me. Your father, that dirt-scrabbling merchant, he stole her. He gave her a life of dust and poverty, and she chose it over me. Over everything I could have given her. He pointed a trembling finger at Evelyn. I came to this God-forsaken town to rebuild. And what did I find? Her ghost. Her legacy. Him and you. A blind, pathetic copy of the woman who destroyed me. I offered to buy this land to wipe the slate clean, but he refused. He clung to her memory just like she clung to her misplaced honor. His confession poured out of him a torrent of poison. So I took it all back. I took the locket to erase the memory of her betrayal. I took his life to erase his pathetic existence. And I was going to take you to show you what she threw away. Sheriff Briggs looked horrified, realizing the monster he had been serving. The prospector shrank back against the wall. It's over, Kane, Cale said, stepping forward. Kane laughed, a wild, unhinged sound. He swept the lamp from his table, plunging his corner of the room into near darkness. In the same motion, he drew a pistol from inside his coat. A violent fight broke out. A gunshot exploded, the muzzle flash, a brief blinding star in the gloom. The room descended into chaos. Amidst the storm's fury, a new storm of violence raged within the saloon. Kyle moved like a phantom in the shadows. Evelyn, in her element of sound and darkness, was not helpless. She heard Briggs scrambling behind the bar, the prospector diving under a table. When one of Kane's foremen lunged at her, she swung her cane with all her might, connecting with his knee with a satisfying crack of bone. He went down howling. The final confrontation was between Cale and Kane. It was a brutal, desperate struggle in the flickering, chaotic light. Evelyn could follow it by the sound grunts of exertion, the thud of fists on flesh, the scrape of boots on the floor. It ended with a final choked cry from Kane and the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Silence fell thick and suffocating. The only sound was the howling of the wind, which seemed to be slowly, finally dying down. As the first pale fingers of dawn pierced the dissipating sandstorm, the grand saloon looked like a shipwreck. Overturned tables shattered glass, and the dark, still form of Silas Kane lay amidst the debris. He had been defeated not by a bullet, but by the bone-handled knife Cale now cleaned with a quiet, grim finality. His reign of terror was over. Sheriff Briggs, his face a pasty gray, emerged from behind the bar, his hands raised in surrender. The prospector and Kane's wounded foreman were huddled in a corner, their bluster and bravado washed away, leaving only fear. The posse who had taken shelter in the hotel across the street finally ventured out into the eerie, sand-drifted dawn. They found not a savage murderer, but a scene of judgment with witnesses who could no longer deny the truth. Evelyn and Cale emerged from the saloon, wounded and exhausted, into the clean, scoured air of the new morning. The townspeople who crept from their homes looked at them differently. The fear was gone, replaced by a mixture of shame and a dawning, grudging respect. They had all been blind, and it had taken the blind girl to make them see. Months passed. The seasons turned. Redemption began slowly to live up to its name. With Cain's empire of lies dismantled, the town seemed to breathe more easily. Sheriff Briggs was gone, replaced by a man of integrity. The trading post, no longer a target, was reopened. Evelyn did not sell it. She reclaimed it, transforming it into the place her father had always wanted it to be. Not just a store, but a bridge. With Cale acting as an emissary, trade with the Apache flourished, built on a foundation of mutual respect rather than suspicion. The post became a hub, a meeting point, where two cultures began to learn from one another. One cool autumn evening, while cleaning out her father's old desk, Evelyn's fingers found a loose board at the back of a deep drawer. Prying it open, she discovered a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon and a small leather-bound journal. They were her mother's. She had Cale read them to her, his low voice giving life to the elegant, faded script. The journal told the story of a young woman, Eleanor, trapped in a gilded cage, engaged to a charismatic but cruel man named Silas. It detailed her discovery of his criminal life, her fear, and her courageous decision to testify against him before fleeing west to build a new life, a true life, with a good and honest man named Samuel Ellsworth. The final entry spoke of her love for her husband and her hopes for their unborn child. The letters gave her the final context, the final piece. They were not the words of a betrayer, but of a survivor. Her mother had not been a ghost to be avenged, but a woman of incredible strength. A strength Evelyn realized that had been passed down to her. The following Sunday, she walked with Cale to the small cemetery on the hill. The sun was warm on her face, and the wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. In her hand, she held the silver locket with the willow tree engraving, recovered from Cain's possession by the new sheriff. She knelt between the two wooden crosses that marked her parents' graves. For a long time, she simply held the locket, its cool weight familiar in her palm. It had been the catalyst for so much pain, a symbol of a past that had nearly destroyed her. Cale stood beside her, a quiet, steady presence. He didn't speak, allowing her the silence she needed. With a final deep breath, Evelyn dug a small hole in the earth at the foot of the headstones. She gently placed the locket inside, nestling it into the dirt. It was an act of release, a burial of the past. Her mother's story was now complete, her father's memory was honored, and her own future was unwritten. She was no longer a girl defined by what she had lost, but a woman in control of her own destiny. She pushed the soil back over the locket, her hands feeling the firm, grounding touch of the earth. She had reclaimed her home, her life, and her name. Standing up, she took Cale's offered hand. His grasp was strong and sure. He had chosen to stay to help her build this new shared future. Together, they stood on the hill overlooking the valley, the quiet promise of a community built on truth, not fear stretching out before them.